Open the pages, step inside. Minds in motion, take the ride. Through the highs, the lows, the fight. Build and strengthen every stride. Move the mind, feel it grow. Sport and soul in the flow. Dream it big, let it show. To the peak we're set to go.
And welcome to our episode of the Sport and Exercise Psychology Book Club and Podcast. My name is David Smith, and today I am with Henrik Herrebrøden, who is a associate professor of psychology at Christiania University College in Oslo, Norway. He has worked as a sports psychology consultant and has been conducting sport research for the past 10 years. He has worked with individuals on resilience and performance under pressure and also with teams. Research is mostly focused on cognitive mechanisms that underpin elite performance, such as attentional focus, as well as talent identification. And today we are discussing the book, How We Learn to Move, A Revolution in the Way We Coach and Practice Sport Skills by Dr. Rob Gray. Henrik, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good, David. Thanks for having me, and congratulations on getting this very relevant podcast going.
Well, thank you. And it's the third episode so far, and it's been going fabulous. We've already been having a lot of fun and discussing some great books. And I'm very excited that you are interested in talking about this specific book today, because it's definitely a topic of mine that's approaching not just sports psychology, but fitness and exercise and the way that we coach sport in general from both a mental standpoint, but also a physical standpoint. So we'll just jump right into it then. What are your thoughts on the book?
I like the book. I think it manages to be very practical. I think it can be read by coaches, practitioners like myself. I'm a sports psychologist and a psychologist by training, so I think many practitioners will appreciate this. And I also think it has a lot of research in it, so any academic, for example, looking to start investigating skill acquisition, especially ecological approaches, which I'm sure we'll get into in this discussion here. I think this book would be a good place to start. I think it's written in a good way, understandable, and very approachable, applicable stuff. How about you?
Indeed, I really like the book. I mean, I'm very interested in the topic of ecological dynamics, especially in regard to not just individual performance, but also team performance and group
Hmm.
performance as well. And when it comes to things like the acquisition of skills, but also not just the acquisition of those skills, but how do you employ them in a appropriate context that they're going to be most relevantly used, right? So a sports specific context or another type of format where it's more about just learning the skill, but being able to have a high flexibility and adaptability in employing the skill in a variety of different situations. And it's interesting for me because I've been doing a lot of deep dive research into ecological dynamics and dynamical systems theory and all these other principles that are underlying a lot of this foundational themes of the book, but it can be sometimes a really hard read. You know, it's
Yeah.
very technical stuff, it's very research focused, it's all these things that make it really kind of hard to grasp. And so I really like this book because Rob Gray really takes that information and translates it into something a little more snackable, as I like to say, and makes it
Hmm.
easier for average coaches, mental performance coaches, sports psychologists, people who want to get an introduction and a basic foundation of what ecological dynamics is and the constraints of that approach and all these other things, make it easy for them to understand and already take those tools and start applying them into their normal practice. And so we oftentimes talk about like the applied research gap, and in sports psychology, it's always like there's such a big gap between research and applied practice. And this is a very
Hmm.
good example of an easy way that they're starting to bridge that.
Yeah, and I think you have to do it like this. I think you need someone like Rob Gray who can use understandable language, talk to, let's say, coaches in a way that's understandable. Because it's very, very hard to write research papers in ways that are easy to understand for non-academics. I've tried, and we've all heard those pieces of advice that you should write your papers as if your grandmother can read it, but it doesn't really fit with the demands of a research paper. You have so many demands in terms of you should provide some methods and details in research papers. I think this is the way to go. This is the way to go. The way that Rob Gray is managing to uh, take some research concepts and put them into language in this book, for example. I think it's a good way to go.
Exactly, and it's an excellent approach. I've actually taken a lot of the basic lessons that he offers and a lot of the implications that he talks about and applied them into my own practice, both in coaching athletes, but also working with my students as well, because I've been teaching undergraduate sports psychology classes for the last year. And so I've been able to incorporate a lot of these concepts, especially with things like the athlete centered approach, the constraints led approach, and all
Mm,
these other components, and incorporate them into the foundational structure of what I teach in sports psychology. So it's made it a lot easier to be able to translate that information as well, but then also apply it in, okay, today we're talking about team performance and dynamics. And now we're talking about goal setting. And then we're going to talk about, competition versus cooperation and things like that, and
mm,
how it kind of applies to all these different things. But then
mm,
also, of course, you got the athlete's work itself. So being able to work with some athletes, and especially when it comes to things where they talk about, oh, I have performance anxiety, or I choke under pressure, or some of these other things, and the athletes themselves are trying to think it through, but they don't really fully understand what the problem is. So this way,
mm.
being able to approach them and say, hey, you clearly have this skill figured out. So
Yeah.
let's take this skill and apply it. Let's mix up your settings and mix up your environment a little bit here and see how you can employ and how well you can do with the skill um, in different types of practice. And what I really liked is he talked a lot about what is it? Repetition without repetition.
Yes. Yes. I think that's one of the key points. I guess it's also worth mentioning that I have written a review on this book. It was published in Sports Coaching Review in 2022. And I really like how he manages to be very specific about some, I would call them old school concepts, some concepts that uh, we're used to seeing in sports that I think many modern coaches move away from these days. And one of those ideas is that you have this sort of perfect technique that you should just repeat over and over again. You should repeat the same technique. It's a one size fits all. I think the book manages to be very specific on how that's not a good approach. By, for example, bringing in some theoretical concepts like the very classical stuff from Bernstein, studying uh, blacksmiths working, and you would think it's the same thing over and over with repetition, but Bernstein was able to show it's actually a lot of variability here. You actually move differently, even though it seems like the same task over and over. So I think that stuff, and also how Gray manages to be very specific on the importance of context. Again, you shouldn't just do training isolated and expect that you can go into a game situation, for example, and be fantastic. So I think the book really manages to be very specific on those things and give it a theoretical framework.
Indeed. And I mean, one of the things that really stood out to me was that he highlights, especially when we talk about sports psychology, mental performance coaching, any type of coaching, really, whether it's strength and conditioning, mental performance, sports specific, whatever, it's always has to be situated in the context in which it is expected for that skill to be employed. And being able to say, okay, well, is this going to translate to a game situation? And I really liked, I think he called out on a lot of functional fitness or a lot of functional training in a lot of ways as well, to be able to say,
Mm,
oh, we talk about functional training of creating exercises that are designed to simulate, the types of demands that are placed upon the body in any kind of specific sport situation. But even then, as you mentioned, it's very reductionist and it only isolates, maybe the movement itself into just what that movement is, but it still doesn't consider like things like the environment, or the
Mm-hmm.
different types of situations, right? So it's very interesting to kind of unpack that and then be able to figure out, okay, from here, how would I take this movement or this skill development and apply it into a direct sports situation? How do you simulate, taking a penalty shot at the last, minute of a football match where your
Mm-hmm.
shot's going to be the tiebreaker or something like that, right? How do you simulate that? And then it starts raining, and then all these other factors start coming into play that you can't control, and it
Mm-hmm.
takes all this extra pressure. And you mentioned, especially in terms of the movement variability, so even repetitive task, in this case, he talked about blacksmithing, but you can see it in sports all the time, right? So for me, I'm a swimmer, and so there's no
Mm-hmm.
shortage of repetitive movements in swimming. And even then, you could still have a lot of variability within each stroke or each
Mm-hmm.
kick in swimming. And so I always found that super interesting because, yeah, if you put little trackers, there's a lot of technology nowadays where we can track biomechanical movement, right? So you put little trackers on your elbow and on your wrist and on your fingers and on your shoulder, and you can use that to determine, okay, each time you take a stroke or each time you make a movement, you could see and track the path of all those trackers in real time, and then be able to say, oh yeah, even though it's a similar movement, each specific repetition has its own unique path. And I just found that super fascinating, right? Because then it goes to show things like, that are at play that we don't fully understand or observe, and things like the engagement of stabilizer muscles, or
Mm-hmm.
different, if in context of swimming, different currents that may be existing in the water that we don't know about, right? So, even in a swimming pool, there's currents in a swimming pool because of the
Yeah.
filtration system that's constantly pumping water. And a lot of swimmers, we always have our pools where we know, okay, when we get to this part of the pool, we get pushed to the side a little bit because of the
Mm.
current. But, you don't really consider a lot of these things when you're swimming lap after lap after lap after lap, but it plays such a huge role in the way that we practice the skills and the way that we develop ourselves, so that we have to be able to have that variability and flexibility within our own, even the most repetitive movements, just to be able to adapt and keep going accordingly, right?
Yeah, I'm doing applied work with a swimming team in Norway now, and I can relate to that. And also I did my PhD focusing on cognition in rowing. And that's another one where it seems like they do the same thing over and over. I even had some reactions from academics hearing I was doing this, like, what's there to think about? What's there to think about in rowing? Like, just pull the oars. Uh, but then I started talking to, in this case, Olympic level rowers, describing their perfect race, describing their task cues, and there are so many details, and there's
Mm-hmm.
so much nuance, and they could describe such detail in what they did. So I think, yeah, it's that quote by Rafael Nadal, which Rob Gray brings up, that every shot is different in the book. It's a really good quote that Rob Gray keeps bringing up in the book several times, I think, because it is different a lot of the time. So just want to throw in one example that I took away from the book was for terminology. Rob Gray said that um, perhaps it's better to talk about injury adaptation instead of rehabilitation because uh, that's what we need to do. We need to adapt constantly. Instead of sort of repeating the same thing, if you get injured, you should get back to what you used to have. Instead of that idea, you can instead try to think of, okay, now that I'm injured, maybe I can adapt, maybe I can move into a new skill.
Right. I really like that too, because it's, as it suggested, if you were to do rehab, you would say, oh, we want to get back to our state before the injury. But the
Hmm.
fact is that the injury occurred, and it has occurred. It has affected the body in some ways, a lot of
Hmm.
ways, even ways that we can't measure or fully even ever understand. So I really like that, because it's not about returning to what it was before, but it's adapting to what has happened,
Hmm.
accepting it. And yes, we need to recover. We need to be able to get our body strengthened up to a point where hopefully the injury doesn't happen again or we cause any more issues. But being able to adapt to that, right? Because what caused the injury in the first place? Is it an overuse injury? Is it a common injury like an ACL tear? Is it my biomechanical related? Is it, something else that's external to the environment, like taking a hit from, the blind side or whatever, which is a football thing, all these ways that could be injured. And we need to both work on the recovery to help them overcome what the injury was and build up strength again, but also what do we need to do to prevent it from happening again, right? So
Mm.
when I was early on in my adult swimming career in college, I should say, I had a major rotator cuff injury in swimming, which is very common in swimming because it's an overuse injury, and it's basically created because in swimming you're utilizing a lot of the muscles in the interior portion of the body, right? So it's
Mm.
like the pecs and the lats and the front deltoids and the middle deltoids and all these muscles in the front at the expense of the antagonist muscles, which are the rotator cuff muscles. And on that one, you don't use those rotator cuff muscles. So they're just kind of being pulled on every time you're taking a stroke. And over time, again and again and again, if those rotator cuff muscles are unable to pull back, then it's just going to be pull, 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 and eventually it's going to start pulling onto the tendons and the ligaments
Mm.
that stabilize the shoulder girdle, and then it's
Mm.
going to make them come inflamed, and that's what causes um what's the name of the tendonitis, right? So
Mhm.
that's what causes tendonitis, right? And that's what the overuse injury is tendonitis. And so when I had to deal with that injury, it was okay, I need to strengthen my rotator cuff muscle. So the recovery, the rehab process was an adaptation process of
Mhm.
saying I need to incorporate these other exercises for these other specific muscle groups that I don't use in swimming because it's crucial for me to have those muscles to be strong for me to be able to be successful in swimming, even if I don't actually use them, right? And so it was very interesting. First time I really kind of understood that perspective of people think, and I coach my swimmers on this because I do both strength and conditioning coaching and mental performance coaching. So I coach my swimmers on this, and I'm like, okay, here, let's do some rotator cuff exercises, help you build those up. And they're thinking, oh, I don't need to work on those. We don't use
Yeah.
those extra muscles during practice. I said, no, you don't. But that's the point. You don't use
Mhm.
those muscles at all. And now you're complaining about shoulder pain because you're just focusing on, you think, oh, if I just work on this, that's all that matters. But there's a lot of
Yeah.
other things, like you said, and little nuances and little variables that we don't fully observe that can play a big role in the overall development of it.
Yeah, and sports get more interesting this way. And that's sort of the theme of my PhD is that this sort of stands against the pure automaticity view that you should just go out and perform and don't think in terms of attentional focus, in terms of thinking, in terms of preparation. I think sports is way more interesting as an athlete too, if you can tune into these nuances and you can have some great discussions and discoveries and I also think performance is better and that's sort of the main theme of my PhD. It turns out that elite athletes they actually attend to various things in order to perform at their best. So, yeah, makes life more interesting than just the sort of don't think approach.
Right. And it's about having fun,
Yeah.
so it's being able to go out there and have fun. And when they say like don't overthink, it's yeah, don't overthink about this specific skill, right? Like, oh my gosh, I'm in a, in this situation, I'm so, it's oh wow, I'm in this situation. Oh, I get to do this. Oh, you get to try that. Oh, this is happening here. And you get to kind of enjoy the whole experience of it all, right? So rather than just
Yeah.
turning yourself off and becoming an automaton, it's let's actually go out there and play a game. Let's go and do some fun stuff. And I mean, that's why we do sports, right? That's why all of this exists is it's a lot of fun for us to do. And when you can really get to the heart of it, the intrinsic motivation of it all, then you end up actually having a higher performance,
Yeah.
because you're not doing it to prove anything. You're not doing it for anything other than just the pure enjoyment and bliss.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess we go a little bit off topic now, but I think what many athletes mean when they say don't overthink or uh, I'm not really thinking. I think don't think about the consequences and the sort of task irrelevant stuff. Uh, I think that's what people tend to mean when they say don't overthink. That's stay away from the thoughts that don't really help performance. should instead try to focus on the task relevant stuff, which is way more interesting and helpful.
Yeah. And from a coaching perspective, Gray advocates a lot for the athlete-centered approach. What are your thoughts on that?
Not really familiar with that approach. I have read a little bit about it, but I can't really say I'm very familiar with that approach. But I did notice that this sort of red line throughout the book, recurring theme was autonomy and sort of placing the athlete in center focus. Like the athlete shouldn't really just be told what to do, shouldn't be just dull practice with boring repetition and being told by a coach what to do. So I did really catch that as a theme that I liked in the book, that the athlete was sort of put center stage, um, and given a good type of attention. Is that sort of what that approach is all about?
Basically, because so the idea is that traditional coaching models was always, oh, do what the coach says. The coach
Mm,
is the one leading everything, right? But as we know, especially in sports and team sports like soccer, hockey, basketball, lacrosse, handball, pretty much any kind of team sport has a very dynamic gameplay.
mhm,
So it's impossible to really strategize very much in advance, right? Because the things are always changing and always evolving. As we said, there's no game situation that's ever the same. Even if you have the same team, the same stadium, the same weather, the same players, the same as much as possible, they will never be the same exact situation that unfolds in the exact same way, right? So with the coach centered approach, they argue that, oh, it's the coach calling the shots. The coach says, here,
mm,
do this, here, do that. Here's our strategy. Here's our way we're going to navigate this whole situation, right? But in team sports, as we know, the game moves so quickly, it's impossible for the coach to be able to a perceive all this information and then communicate it appropriately to the players to do what to do. So with an athlete centered approach, it's teaching the athletes how to navigate the dynamic situations of
mhm,
the game itself, right? And so being able to say, okay, it's the athletes leading the pack. It's the athletes that are making the decisions as they go along. And so by putting that onus on the athletes, it's allowing them to the point where the coach does everything in training, right? So the coach can lead
mm,
the training, guide the athletes on skill development, but he's not teaching them what to do. He's letting them discover it for themselves.
mhm.
And so being able to say, hey, all right, we're going to create this situation, say in soccer, a 3-on-2, defensive, offensive thing, right? Maybe he wants to teach a skill about, I don't know, being able to set up a shot with an assist on, scoring. I don't know, but whatever he's trying to teach him is rather than him going and saying, "Here, you do this, you do that, you do this, you do that." He just sets up the basic parameters of the situation and then
Mhm.
just lets the athletes kind of figure it out for themselves. And so this
Yeah.
case, it's the athletes that are learning by doing rather than learning by listening, if that makes sense. And this way, it
Yeah.
creates a little more autonomy within those athletes to be able to have a more awareness of what the game situation is, and then be able to act accordingly on their own without having the feedback from the coach.
Yeah, again, I think the book and Rob manages to be specific on something that many coaches want to do, but it's actually quite difficult in reality, which is basically trying to shut up, trying to use fewer words. Like if you need a lot of instruction, perhaps you haven't done a good enough job in the preparation and the drill selection. So, again, they managed to be very specific in this book. So, for example, the constraints from Carl Newell, where you have three layers of constraints. You have constraints in the individual, the person. So that could be fatigue, for example. So if you want to coach somebody or train realistically, if you're going to be fatigued in the game, you should also practice with fatigue in practice. You have task constraints, so the coach can set up rules. The coach can, like you mentioned there, set up a small-sided game or a situation, 3 versus 2, which sort of naturally invites certain things. So instead of explaining everything, the coach can sort of set up, here's a task that will sort of invite you to do certain things, and you can also manipulate the more overall environment, like practicing in different weather conditions and the more global stuff as well. So I guess this is what many coaches try to do, and in this book you find this very specific framework. For example, these 3 types of constraints by Carl Newell, for example.
Exactly. And it's something that I actually am trying to do right now also as a coach. I just started coaching a kids soccer team, kindergarten level kids, right? So a lot of these kids, first time ever playing any kind of formal organized soccer. And proposing this to the head of the soccer club about this exact kind of approach, because they have their traditional athletic development models that they use, and it's always like set up these extravagant cone things and trying to teach them all these different skills, like, oh, you got your monkey dribbles and you got your cheetah dribbles and here's passing and here's like, okay, you got your goalie and all this. And I was like, basically like, I'm just going to set up the field and just put the kids in there and say, you try to score on that goal, you try and score on that goal, play. And set up obviously some basic rules, right? And things that we enforce with the kids, but a lot of it's just, let's just play soccer. Let's just, and maybe little things like, okay, let's we have a foul rule. So sometimes the kids, they get a little rough. And so we have to, kind of stop and say, okay, what do we want to do? Avoid fouls, right? But a lot of the things are just letting the kids kind of figure it out for themselves. And it's actually been so much fun because we've been playing these games. And sometimes the parents at first, they were kind of like, what's this guy doing? But then they started to kind of figure it out as well. So we were playing some of these soccer games. And for example, in the first games, we had these very small, like 2 meter, like maybe 1.5 by 1 meter goal, like very small little goals that we had on each side of the field for the games, right? And the kids, for example, on their own would strategize. There's no assigned position, so all the kids are equally responsible for offense and defense, and there's no goalies, no any assigned positions. And it was interesting because the kids would strategize, oh, let's create a wall of us in front of the goal. And so there'd be like three kids like standing there in the goal trying to like, create a wall, right? And it was so funny because sometimes the parents are like, what are you doing, kids? What are you doing? You can't, and I'm just watching it go down. And then the other kid comes in and actually scores a goal through the wall. So he kicks it through the legs and it goes in. And then you realize the kids, when they do this, they stop doing the wall because they realize it didn't work. And you can see kind of now they're exploring a lot of these different creative things. Like they just started trapping. They learned how to trap the ball where, you kind of lock the ball in between your ankles. They learned how to trap the ball like that, but nobody taught them. They just, and so being able to like, now we're starting to discover these skills, and now the parents are starting to figure out what we're doing because I've tried to explain it to them and they kind of like, okay, yeah, okay, but now they're starting to see, they're like, did you teach that? Nope. Did you? Nope. And it's just all been playing, and the kids, it's been a lot more physically active and more activating and engaging for them, but it's been really great to see like the kind of creativity the little kids can come up with when it comes to these kind of things, and they're learning these skills naturally. So the other coaches on the other programs are teaching them classic, like, here, kids, this is how you do it. But these kids, they just figure it out for themselves as they go along. And it's been super fun to watch.
And that's got to be more effective than being told why the wall isn't a good idea or anything like that. Sort of reminds me of the psychologist training we did in school. It's like, that's sort of what you try to do with your clients. You try to make it seem or sort of facilitate that they can come up with solutions on their own. Because, advice that just comes from other people doesn't really have a good chance of being followed very much.
Right.
It's way more effective if people can figure it out for themselves.
Exactly, and it's been a rewarding experience in a lot of ways, because it's also made the games way more exciting and interesting. A lot of times with especially kids in youth soccer, sometimes the parents are kind of like, "Yay, go kids!" and but it kind of gets a little boring after a while. But our games, like the kids have been taking more shots on the goal, been able to try and defend the goal more. For example, at one point, like all the team will be on one end, all the kids will be on one end because that's kind of where the goal gameplay is. But then the kid on the other team gets the ball and he starts running it down to the field. And then all of a sudden you
Hmm.
see like 2 or 3 kids from the other team trying to book it even faster and sprinting as fast as they can to put themselves in front of the goal to try
Hmm.
and stop the kid from scoring. And so you get to see all these different ways, and the parents are loving it because they're like, ah, ow, ow, and they get like the energy going, which gets the kids more excited and just overall creates a much more fun environment. I mean, and we get so many shots on the goals that maybe they block like 50% of them, but they're
Hmm.
starting to pick up. I mean, we had a game last week that was, the red team scored 3 goals in the first like minute, and at
Hmm.
first I was like, okay, is this gonna be interesting? But then the blue team figured out, oh, this is what they're doing. So we're gonna start doing this now. And then before
Hmm.
you know it, the blue team was scoring more shots on the goal. And so being
Yeah.
able to kind of see how that dynamic envelops, and the parents are having fun, the kids are having fun, and in the end, I think it's a lot. They're learning a lot more just from doing it than what I could teach them in any situation, right? And
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to
so
get into any sort of critique of the book? Was there anything that you sort of missed or uh, didn't like that much about this book?
on my end, there really wasn't anything that stood out that I was really like, I disagree with this a lot.
Mm,
I didn't nothing like that really kind of stood out to me. But what I would say is, I mean, for me it was a very easy read.
yeah.
And I mean, which is not a bad thing, because for me, I mean, I've been diving into some very technical, super detailed research, nerdy, technobabble type works on exactly this topic. So for me, I
Hmm.
was able to like zip through this book really quickly. So on my end, it was a lot of stuff I already knew. So it was just a lot of in more simple terms and concepts. But that's not a critique, because I'm obviously not necessarily the target audience at this point
Hmm.
for that kind of book. But it was interesting though, because I feel like it would be vague enough that there isn't really like, yeah, there's some things you could take away, but it's still like, for example, when he says, things about like the athlete centered approach, right? Like, even for you who had actually done a full book review on this, there wasn't a whole
Hmm.
lot you were able to really gain out of a lot of that. So
Hmm.
being able to say, okay, well, what really is, how do we do an athlete centered approach? Really dive into that. I
Yeah.
think could have been a little bit more in depth in a lot of ways. What are
And
your
I think
thoughts?
I think this goes back to the type of book it is, because it's really hard. I mean, we need to acknowledge it's very hard to write a book for practitioners, for coaches, for academics, uh, and not sort of leave some question marks. So yeah, I do think there are a few question marks. So one thing I write about in my review is that uh, I did have some questions in the end regarding transfer. For example, when you add constraints in practice, task constraints, for example, how should you do it to get the best sort of transfer? Because Rob says in the book, it can be very, very hard sometimes to make the new solution sticky. So when you remove the task constraint, the athlete will very often go back to the old solution, as he calls it. So I did miss a little bit more specificity there. That would have been nice. Like, for example, how often should you use a very constraint? How should you sort of phase it out? Um, Apart from that, I think yeah, it's the good old sort of traditional versus new approach debate. Uh, that is a little bit simplified, I think. And Rob says it himself. He did use a straw man in this book. He sort of uses this traditional approach or information processing approach, straw man, and he does have a few portrays of that approach that uh, doesn't really hold up if you look at the literature. So uh, I do think that was a little simplified. Are you at all engaged in that sort of debate that's been going on between the so-called ecological approaches on the one hand and the more cognitive or information
What they call
processing
the
approaches?
activist approach, I think, is the other side of that. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I won't say I'm like really actively involved in the debate of it all, but I definitely got some opinions on it.
Okay.
But yeah, kind of like, to kind of branch off of what you were saying there for a little bit as well, is Especially I think it's really easy because it's a lot of it's still generally theoretical.
Yeah.
So I think that the book really could have benefited more from like real world like examples and applications of it by saying here,
Yeah.
in this specific kind of context, such and such coach did this, but then he tried that or something like that, right? So it's like you said, it's a very, it's hard for sometimes to be transferable to really understand, okay, how would we really apply this in a specific practice setting as well? But yeah, with the whole kind of ecological versus an activist approach thing as well. I'm very much more on the ecological side. Like I'm not I always hate it when it's like you have to choose one side or the other
Right. Right.
because I agree with both, and there's like things I agree with and disagree with both. But for me, with especially with something like dynamical systems, it's like, why do we have to choose? There's elements of both that work really well that we can incorporate as part of kind of our overall process, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that you can talk about, like, yeah, we do have mirror neurons, and we do when we see like a skill being, used by somebody else, it kind of activates things in our own brain and things like that. But at the same time, like, okay, it's raining outside right now, and I need to be able to immediately adjust to some different environmental context that maybe I don't fully perceive, right? And I just did a whole thing in one of my sports psychology classes on the flow state. And in the flow
Hmm.
state, one of the things they talk about is you're operating on this whole sense of just full relaxation that you don't even fully process what's actually
Hmm.
happening. You're just like in the flow state, right? But then you can start suddenly employing skills and techniques and movements that you're not even consciously thinking about or perceiving, and B, you don't even have any awareness that you actually did it.
Yeah.
And you can be able to do something like that in response to what a situation is occurring. A great example that we talked about last week, or on the last episode of this podcast with a, I can't remember all of a sudden, but we talked about the flow state, and one of the things we talked about was Laird Hamilton doing the surfing a wave in Tahiti, and how he employed a skill to stabilize himself. He was surfing this huge wave that was basically like, you got to do this or you don't, and if you don't, you're dead. And so he's
Hmm.
surfing, and he squats down on his surfboard as he's surfing the wave and drags his hand along the water. And afterwards, when they asked him, because at the time nobody had ever done that in surfing at all, that was not a thing. So his friends had asked him, "Why did you drag your hand in the water like that?" And he actually had to go look at the video and watch him do it. And they realized later on, oh, he did that because he needed to stabilize himself in order to be able to stay upright on the wave. But that was not something that he consciously perceived or even remembered doing. And he, was like, I don't really know why I did that, but unconsciously he knew, okay, in this specific situation, because it wasn't a skill that he had practiced before, it knows nothing that was trained or even considered to be a
Yeah.
thing. It was just something that he automatically did because in this specific situation with that specific wave, he needed to stabilize himself, and that was the way that he did it, just based off his own working experience as a surfer. So there's definitely, I think, room for both in terms of this kind of argument that you don't really need to take a side.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm definitely with you. And I know there are different opinions on this. I know there are people who would say you should pick a side. But that example you gave there can be explained from different perspectives, right? You can use the more experience and memory and subconscious processing approach, like you mentioned there. You could use more of a Gibson approach with direct perception. You sort of perceive affordances. Um, and yeah, I think it's a bit unfortunate when information processing or the more cognitive approach is sort of portrayed as this enemy, um, where in fact if we consider ecological approaches and cognitive approaches, they can actually emphasize a lot of the same things. So I can share one thing from the book which I found a bit problematic was that Gray talks about Richard Smith and generalized motor programs, and using an example on page 32. Here's what it may look like. In a forehand in tennis, a program can be rotate around shoulder 30 degrees, then around elbow 20 degrees, then around wrist by 15 degrees. It's a specific set of detailed commands given by the central controller to the workers below the joints and the muscles. So then I go to read Schmidt's work, and it's nothing like that. Schmidt actually talks about these programs being very general, and he actually emphasizes variability. He will say a kid learning how to jump over something, for example, should try as many different approaches as possible. And you should maybe have one program for all the different types of throwing. So, i.e., variability, which is one of the recurring themes in this book. So, the unfortunate thing in these cases would be that you sort of create this dichotomy, and people feel like they should have to choose one side or the other. Seems like they have a lot in common, uh, and that's what we like about this book. It's very specific on these things that I would associate with more modern coaching. These are the things we want more of in our coaching. I would just add that the ecological approaches may not be uh, that unique in that they are the only approaches that have these views. But that would be my sort of criticism. But I do think this is very uh, this can happen when you try to write a book like this because you do want to be short, you do want to be understandable, and it's easy sometimes to be a little bit too simplistic by creating dichotomies, for example.
And remember too, it's also this is kind of the old school way that we've always done it, and now you're trying to propose kind of this
Yeah.
new concept here. So it's you got to kind of market to the audience, right? You don't want to completely say, oh, the way that you did this has all been crap. No, it's actually been somewhat successful, which is why they've been doing it for a long time. So, but
Hmm.
this may be a better way to do it, but you can't say, well, stop doing that, start doing this. You have to kind of create that transition and be able to say, well, there is room for what you have been doing. There's a reason why you've been doing it, but also try this.
Yeah.
And so have the flexibility on both ends, which ironically is one of the themes of the book is how do you be adaptable and flexible on a lot of things. I would say
Yeah.
so to kind of wrap things up a little bit, what are your top takeaways from the book?
Top takeaways would be context matters for sure. And I guess that's one of the more valuable contributions from ecological approaches for me. I guess it's that sort of famous quote by, I think it was William Mays in the 70s who said, ask not what's inside your head, but what your head is inside of. So, which context are you in? And we should try to coach in a context, considering the athlete. I think the athlete-centered approach that you mentioned sounds very interesting and good for that. So context matters and adaptability wins over repetition. That would be two key takeaways for me. How about you?
Nice, I like that. A lot of agreement there for sure. I really like embracing variability in practice, right? So it's not just about repetitive movements, but how can we kind of create some variability there to be able to repeat and acquire skills in various even nuanced contexts. And on that front, also with errors are essential to learning, right? So you have to make mistakes, you have to commit errors, you know, because that's how you learn. I mean, for me, taking an athlete-centered approach to coaching, that's how I'm helping to coach the kids, and teaching them is to be able to say, okay, we're going to keep playing, and if they commit an error, a rule violation, or something like that within the constraints, okay, we're going to use that as a learning opportunity. But a lot of times, just let them kind of figure it out for themselves and let them make those mistakes and be able to figure out, okay, maybe that's not the best way to do it. Let's try something else. So definitely some great takeaways on that front as well. And I think the last one kind of related to that is like you said, it's don't let the coaches should guide, but not necessarily dictate. So like you
Hmm.
said, less talking from the coaches and more just kind of here, let's challenge the athletes to kind of figure it out in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So and where can people find you on social media, on the internet, on places to connect?
I am mostly on LinkedIn. So I guess the bad news is that people have to spell my name. But if they can do that correctly, they will find me. I'm just using my name.
I'm
So
also going to
Henrik,
have your LinkedIn on the show notes as well. So if they can't spell your
perfect.
name, we'll just go to the show notes and click the link.
Maybe they can copy paste. Sounds good. Yeah, I'm always open to hearing from people, and yeah, good conversations like this and anything. Yeah, very open to being approached and talk to people about sports psychology and sports science.
Love it. And thank you for joining us. And we are excited that you were able to come on and chat about this book with me. So, like I said, your LinkedIn is going to be in the show notes as well. And I definitely encourage all my listeners to rate and review our podcast, help me build up an audience and get the algorithm chugging along and all these things like that. And yeah, look forward to seeing, seeing y'all on, I guess I'm really seeing y'all because can't really see my audience right now, but I look forward to the next episode as well. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Open the pages, step inside. Minds in motion, take the ride. Through the highs, the lows, the fight. Building strength in every stride. Move the mind, feel it grow. Sport and soul in the flow. Dream it big, let it show. To the peak we're set to go. We talk, we share, we find the way. Fuel the fire every day. Books and voices light the spark. Chasing goals and leaving marks. Move the mind, feel it grow. Sport and soul in the flow. Dream it big, let it show. To the peak we're set to go. Move the mind, feel it grow. Sport and soul in the flow. Dream it big, let it show. To the peak we're set to go. To the peak we're set to go.